At 73 years old, I thought I'd heard every possible insult life could throw at me. I'd survived my husband's death, raised 4 children mostly on my own, and built a small fortune through decades of careful investing and running my late husband's hardware store. But nothing prepared me for the words that would come out of my own daughter's mouth on that humid Tuesday morning in June, words that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. I was standing in my kitchen in Clearwater, Florida, making my famous blueberry pancakes for what I thought would be a lovely family breakfast. The morning sun streamed through my yellow curtains, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden spirits. My kitchen had always been the heart of our home, with its cheerful sunflower wallpaper and the collection of ceramic roosters that my late husband Frank had given me over the years. Every surface told a story of family meals, birthday celebrations, and quiet morning conversations over coffee. The phone call that shattered my world came while I was flipping the last batch of pancakes. It was my oldest daughter, Patricia, calling from her real estate office in Tampa. I could hear the familiar background noise of ringing phones and busy conversations, the soundtrack of her successful career that had always made me so proud. "Mom, we need to talk about your vacation plans," she said without any preamble, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd developed since becoming a successful businesswoman. It was the same voice she used with difficult clients, measured and slightly condescending. "What about them, sweetheart?" I asked, holding the phone between my ear and shoulder, while I arranged the pancakes on my grandmother's blue willow platter. I was genuinely confused because I hadn't mentioned any specific vacation plans to anyone yet. I'd been thinking about taking a cruise, something I'd dreamed about since Frank passed 5 years ago, but I hadn't made any concrete arrangements. "Mom, you know I love you, but we all think it's time to be realistic about your limitations. At your age, traveling alone isn't safe or practical. What if something happens to you on one of those cruise ships? What if you fall? What if you have a medical emergency in the middle of the ocean?" The pancake turner slipped from my hand and clattered onto the tile floor. I stood there, frozen, processing what I'd just heard. My own daughter, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep thousands of nights, was telling me I was too old to take a vacation. "Patricia, I'm 73, not 93. I'm in perfect health, and I've been taking care of myself just fine for the past 5 years." "I know, Mom, but cruise ships are dangerous for elderly people. The statistics are alarming. Plus, think about the expense. Wouldn't it be better to save that money for something more practical? Maybe some renovations to make your house safer. We're setting aside more for medical expenses as you get older." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as Patricia continued talking. This wasn't just concern for my safety. There was something else in her voice, something calculating that I'd never heard before. As she spoke, I could hear someone else in the background, a man's voice that sounded familiar but muffled. "Who's there with you?" I asked, interrupting her mid-sentence about the dangers of norovirus on cruise ships. There was a pause, then Patricia said, "Oh, it's just Robert. He stopped by the office to discuss some business." Robert was my son-in-law, Patricia's husband of 22 years and a successful financial advisor. He was also the man who had been managing my investment portfolio since Frank died, a decision I was beginning to question for the first time. "Let me talk to him," I said, though something in my gut told me I wasn't going to like what I heard. "Evelyn?" Robert's voice came through the phone, smooth and professional as always. "Patricia and I have been discussing your financial situation, and we really think you should reconsider any major expenditures right now. The market has been volatile, and at your age, preservation of capital should be your primary concern." "My financial situation is just fine, Robert. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Been managing money longer than you've been alive. Of course. But cruise ships are incredibly expensive. And when you factor in tips, excursions, specialty dining, you're looking at thousands of dollars for just one trip. Multiply that by several trips, and you're talking about a significant portion of your nest egg." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, the same chair where I'd fed 3 generations of children, where I'd balanced checkbooks and paid bills for decades. Something was very wrong with this conversation. Robert had never questioned my spending before, and I'd certainly never asked for his opinion on my vacation plans. "How do you even know I'm planning multiple cruises?" I asked. Another pause, then Patricia's voice came back on the line. "Mom, you've been talking about cruise ships for months. Remember when you mentioned it at Easter? And then again at Mother's Day. We just want to make sure you're being realistic about your finances." But I hadn't mentioned cruises at Easter or Mother's Day. I'd thought about them, dreamed about them during those quiet evening hours when the loneliness felt heaviest. But I'd been careful not to share those dreams with anyone. My family had enough to worry about without adding my personal desires to their list. After I hung up the phone, I sat in my kitchen surrounded by the aroma of blueberry pancakes that no one would eat, trying to piece together what had just happened. My daughter and son-in-law seemed to know more about my vacation plans than I did, and they were actively trying to discourage me from taking any trips at all. That afternoon, my youngest daughter Michelle stopped by for what she claimed was a surprise visit. Michelle worked as a nurse at Tampa General Hospital and lived about 30 minutes away with her husband Carlos and their teenage twin boys. She was my baby, the child who had always been most like me in temperament, spontaneous and optimistic, where Patricia was cautious and calculating. "Mom, you look upset," she said, settling herself at my kitchen table with a glass of the sweet tea I always kept in the refrigerator. "Is everything okay?" I told her about my conversation with Patricia and Robert, watching her face carefully for any signs that she knew more than she was letting on. Michelle listened with the patient attention she'd learned from years of nursing, nodding at appropriate moments and making sympathetic sounds. "Well," she said when I finished, "I can see both sides. Patricia's just worried about you, but I also think you should be able to take whatever vacation you want. You've earned it." Relief flooded through me. At least one of my children understood that I wasn't ready to be treated like an invalid. "However," Michelle continued, and my heart sank, "maybe there's a compromise. What if you took a nice vacation somewhere closer to home? A lovely resort in Orlando? Or maybe a long weekend in Savannah? Somewhere we could reach you quickly if something happened." "Michelle, nothing is going to happen to me. I'm not fragile." "I know, Mom, but cruise ships are just so isolated. And honestly, the expense really is significant. Carlos and I have been talking about it, and we think your money would be better invested in making your house more comfortable for aging in place. Maybe a walk-in shower, some grab bars, better lighting." There it was again. Everyone seemed to be talking about my money and my plans, but no one had asked me what I wanted or needed. I felt like I was being managed, handled like a child who couldn't be trusted to make her own decisions. That evening, I called my son David, who lived in Jacksonville with his wife Sandra and their 3 young children. David was my middle child, quiet and thoughtful, a high school history teacher who had always been my most philosophical child. If anyone would give me an honest perspective, it would be David. "Hi, Mom," he said, but his voice sounded strange, distracted. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. I wanted to talk to you about something Patricia said today." "Oh, about the cruise thing?" "Yeah, she mentioned that." "Look, Mom, I think we all just want what's best for you." "But David, I haven't even booked a cruise yet. I was just thinking about it." "Right, but Mom, thinking about it and actually doing it are 2 different things. Have you really researched what's involved? The travel to the port, navigating airports with luggage, being on a ship with thousands of strangers. It's a lot for someone your age, someone my age." There it was again, that phrase that made me feel like I'd suddenly become invisible, irrelevant, a problem to be solved rather than a person with dreams and desires. "David, I'm not decrepit. I drive, I shop, I volunteer at the library twice a week. I'm perfectly capable of getting on a cruise ship." "I know, Mom, but accidents happen. What if you fell on a wet deck? What if you got sick and needed medical attention in the middle of the ocean?" The whole family would worry constantly. After I hung up with David, I felt more confused than ever. All 3 of my children seemed to be reading from the same script, using the same arguments about safety and expense and my age. But there was something else beneath their concern, something that felt less like love and more like control. I decided to call my youngest child, my son Michael, who lived in Atlanta with his partner James. Michael worked in marketing for a tech company and had always been my most direct child, the one who would tell me the truth even when it wasn't what I wanted to hear. "Hey, Mom," Michael said when he answered, and I could hear the sound of a restaurant in the background. "Can I call you back? James and I are at dinner." "This will just take a minute, honey. I wanted to ask you about something." "Is this about the cruise discussion? Because honestly, Mom, I think everyone's making a big deal out of nothing. If you want to take a cruise, take a cruise. You're not ancient." Finally, someone who understood. "Thank you, Michael. That's exactly what I was thinking." "But," he continued, and my heart sank again, "I do think you should consider the practical aspects. Maybe start with something smaller, a short 3-day cruise to the Bahamas, just to see how you handle it. And definitely go with a travel companion. Solo travel at your age really isn't advisable. Even Michael, my most supportive child, was treating me like I needed supervision and guidance for something as simple as taking a vacation. That night, I lay in the king-sized bed that had felt too big and too empty since Frank died, staring at the ceiling and trying to understand what was happening to my family. When had my children stopped seeing me as their capable, independent mother and started seeing me as a burden to be managed? When had my age become more important than my autonomy? The next morning, I decided to do something that would have seemed unnecessary just days before. I drove to the bank and requested a detailed accounting of all my financial accounts. What I discovered there would change everything I thought I knew about my family's sudden concern for my welfare. Sitting in the sterile conference room at First National Bank, across from a young financial advisor named Jennifer, who barely looked old enough to have a college degree, I learned that someone had been making inquiries about my accounts. Not accessing them, not making transactions, but asking detailed questions about balances, investment performance, and withdrawal procedures. "Who's been asking these questions?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I'd intended. Jennifer looked uncomfortable, shuffling through the papers in my file. "Well, Mrs. Harrison, your son-in-law Robert Chen is listed as your financial advisor, so he has legitimate access to this information. But there have also been inquiries from other family members." "What kind of inquiries?" "Questions about your spending patterns, your monthly expenses, and specifically about large withdrawals." Someone asked about the procedures for cruise bookings and travel expenses. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. My family wasn't just concerned about my safety on a hypothetical cruise. They were monitoring my finances, tracking my spending, and apparently discussing my money among themselves. "Has anyone actually accessed my accounts or made any transactions?" "No, ma'am. All activity on your accounts has been initiated by you personally. But there have been several phone calls and one in-person visit, asking about protocols for elderly account holders and what safeguards the bank has in place for customers who might be experiencing cognitive decline." Cognitive decline. The words hit me like a physical blow. Someone in my family thought I was losing my mental faculties, or they were laying the groundwork to claim that I was. I left the bank feeling shaken and confused. In the parking lot, I sat in my car for 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd learned. My children weren't just concerned about my safety or my finances. They were actively investigating my capabilities and laying groundwork for what looked suspiciously like preparation for taking control of my decisions. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my sister Helen, who lived in a retirement community in Phoenix. Helen was 2 years older than me and had been dealing with her own family's increasing attempts to manage her life. "Evelyn, honey, what's wrong?" Helen said as soon as she heard my voice. We'd been sisters for 73 years, and she could read my moods better than anyone. I told her everything about the phone calls, the bank inquiries, and the sudden family consensus that I was too old for cruise ships. Helen listened without interrupting, making the occasional sympathetic sound that told me she understood exactly what I was experiencing. "Oh, sweetie," she said when I finished. "I hate to tell you this, but it sounds like your kids are getting ready to declare you incompetent." "What do you mean?" "It's the same thing Richard's kids tried to pull with him last year. First, they started questioning his judgment about money. Then they began talking about safety concerns. Before he knew it, they were suggesting he needed someone to help him make important decisions. It's a slow takeover, disguised as concern." Richard was Helen's neighbor in the retirement community, a 78-year-old former engineer who was sharper than most people half his age. But his children had successfully convinced him to give them power of attorney by gradually undermining his confidence in his own decision-making abilities. But why would my children want to control my finances? They all have successful careers, they don't need my money. Honey, it's not always about needing the money right now. It's about making sure they have access to it later. And sometimes, it's about feeling like they know what's best for you better than you do. Some adult children get so afraid of their parents making mistakes that they forget their parents have the right to make those mistakes. After I hung up with Helen, I sat in my living room looking at the family photos that covered every surface. Pictures of birthday parties, graduations, weddings, holidays. Decades of love and laughter and shared memories. How had we gotten from those happy moments to this place where my own children were investigating my finances and discussing my competency behind my back? The next few days passed in a blur of careful observation and growing unease. I paid attention to conversations in ways I never had before, listening for the subtle signs that my family was coordinating their approach to managing me. The signs were everywhere, once I knew what to look for. Patricia called every day, always asking about my plans for the week, my doctor's appointments, my activities. She'd never shown this level of interest in my daily routine before. Michelle stopped by twice, ostensibly to visit, but actually to comment on things around the house that might be quote, safety concerns. A loose kitchen faucet that had been loose for months suddenly became an urgent repair issue. The small rug in my hallway, which had never bothered anyone before, was now a fall risk. David sent me articles about cruise ship accidents and elderly travelers who had experienced medical emergencies while traveling. The articles all emphasized the importance of traveling with companions and the dangers of solo travel for seniors. Michael called to tell me about a coworker's grandmother who had fallen on a cruise ship and spent 3 days in the ship's medical facility. It was like they were all working from the same playbook, building a case for why I shouldn't be trusted to make my own travel decisions. But it wasn't until I accidentally overheard a phone conversation between Patricia and Robert that I understood the full scope of what was happening. I had stopped by Patricia's house to drop off some tomatoes from my garden, something I'd been doing every summer for 20 years. Patricia wasn't home, but Robert was in his home office with the door partially open, talking on the phone in the low, intense voice he used for serious business conversations. "I know it seems premature," he was saying, "but we need to establish the pattern now while she's still making questionable decisions. The cruise ship thing is perfect because it demonstrates poor judgment about safety and finances." I froze in the hallway, the bag of tomatoes clutched in my hands like a shield. "The key is to document everything," Robert continued. "Every impulsive purchase, every time she doesn't remember a conversation, every incident that shows declining judgment. We're not trying to hurt her, we're trying to protect her from herself." There was a pause while the person on the other end of the line spoke, then Robert's voice again. "The estate planning attorney says we need at least 6 months of documented incidents to petition for guardianship, but it could be done faster if there's a clear pattern of endangering herself. The cruise booking would be perfect evidence of diminished capacity if we can get her to actually make the reservation." Guardianship. The word hit me like a lightning bolt. My son-in-law was talking to a lawyer about taking legal control of my life, and he was planning to use my desire to take a vacation as evidence that I was mentally incompetent. I backed out of the house as quietly as I could, leaving the tomatoes on the front porch. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start my car. In 32 years of marriage to my daughter, Robert had never given me any reason to distrust him. He'd been a loving husband to Patricia, a good father to their children, and respectful to me. But now I was discovering that he saw me as a problem to be solved, a risk to be managed. That evening, I called a lawyer myself, not for guardianship or estate planning, but for advice about protecting myself from my own family. The consultation was scheduled for the following Monday, and I spent the weekend in a strange state of hyper-awareness, seeing my children's behavior through completely new eyes. Sunday dinner had been a tradition in our family for as long as I could remember. Every week, my children and grandchildren would gather at my house for pot roast and mashed potatoes, and the kind of loud, chaotic family time that had sustained us through every crisis and celebration. But this Sunday felt different. Instead of enjoying the familiar chaos, I found myself analyzing every comment, every suggestion, every expression of concern. "Mom, you seem distracted," Michelle said as we cleared the dishes. "Are you feeling okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just thinking about some things I need to take care of this week." "What kind of things?" Patricia asked, her voice carrying that careful tone I was learning to recognize. "Do you need help with anything?" "Just some personal business. Nothing for you to worry about." "Mom," David said, "you know we're always here if you need help with anything. Paperwork, finances, medical appointments. You don't have to handle everything by yourself anymore." Anymore. As if my age had suddenly made me incapable of managing my own affairs. As if 73 was the magical number where independence became irresponsibility. "I appreciate that," I said carefully, "but I'm managing just fine." "Of course you are," Robert said, his voice smooth and reassuring. "But it never hurts to have backup plans. Speaking of which, Patricia and I have been talking about updating your estate plan. Tax laws have changed since Frank died, and there might be some opportunities to save your beneficiaries significant money down the road." "My estate plan is fine as it is." "Well, certainly, but wouldn't it be worth having a professional review? Just to make sure everything is optimized?" I looked around the table at my family, these people I had loved and sacrificed for and trusted completely, and realized that they were no longer seeing me as their matriarch. I was becoming their project, their responsibility, their burden to bear. And the worst part was that they probably genuinely believed they were acting in my best interests. That night, after everyone had gone home and I was alone with the dirty dishes and leftover pot roast, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be managed, handled, or controlled. I wasn't going to let my children's fears and assumptions dictate the rest of my life. I was going to take that cruise. Not just one cruise, but as many as I wanted, whenever I wanted, for as long as I was physically able. And if my family wanted to treat me like I was incompetent for wanting to see the world, then maybe it was time to show them exactly how competent I really was. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. Tomorrow's meeting with the lawyer would tell me how to protect myself legally. Tonight, I had other plans. I was going to find out exactly what my children had been saying about me behind my back, and I was going to use that information to plan my response. I had learned a lot about strategy in my 73 years, and my children were about to discover that underestimating their mother was the biggest mistake they could possibly make. The meeting with attorney Margaret Fisher on Monday morning revealed the true scope of what I was facing. Margaret was a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who specialized in elder law, and she didn't sugarcoat the reality of my situation. "Mrs. Harrison," she said, spreading several legal documents across her mahogany desk. "What you're describing follows a very predictable pattern. Adult children who believe their parent is making poor decisions often start with financial monitoring, then move to questioning competency, and finally petition for guardianship or conservatorship." I sat in the leather chair across from her desk, my purse clutched tightly in my lap, feeling like I was learning about a disease I'd unknowingly contracted. "But I haven't made any poor decisions. I haven't even booked a cruise yet. That's irrelevant from a legal standpoint. What matters is whether they can convince a judge that you're likely to make decisions that could endanger your health, safety, or financial security. The fact that you're considering solo travel at 73, combined with any evidence they can gather about forgetfulness, physical limitations, or financial choices they deem unwise, could be enough." Margaret pulled out a thick folder and opened it to reveal pages of notes. "I've handled dozens of these cases, and they almost always follow the same trajectory. First, family members express concern about judgment. Then they document incidents. Finally, they file a petition claiming the elderly person needs protection from themselves. What kind of incidents? Anything that can be interpreted as poor judgment or declining capacity. Forgetting appointments, making purchases they consider unnecessary, refusing medical advice, driving infractions, even choosing friends or activities the family disapproves of. In one case, I had a client whose daughter used her decision to adopt a cat as evidence of diminished mental capacity. I thought about Robert's phone conversation, his mention of documenting questionable decisions and establishing patterns. What can I do to protect myself? Several things. First, we'll draft new documents establishing your competency and your explicit wishes regarding your autonomy. Second, we'll create safeguards for your finances that protect you without giving control to anyone else. And third, we'll document your current mental and physical state with medical evaluations. Margaret handed me a business card. I'm referring you to Dr. Rebecca Torres, a geriatric psychiatrist who specializes in competency evaluations. She'll do a comprehensive assessment that we can use to establish your mental acuity if anyone challenges it later. How long do I have before they can file a petition? Based on what you've told me, they're still in the evidence-gathering phase. But Mrs. Harrison, I need to warn you about something. Once family members start down this path, they rarely stop voluntarily. Even if you prove your competency, they may continue to believe they know what's best for you. This could permanently damage your relationships with your children. I left Margaret's office with a heavy heart and a folder full of legal documents to review. The drive home through the familiar streets of Clearwater felt different now, like I was seeing my neighborhood through the eyes of someone who might soon lose the right to live there independently. Every traffic light, every turn, every decision felt weighted, with the knowledge that someone might be watching and judging my capabilities. That afternoon, I decided to conduct my own investigation. If my family was gathering evidence about my declining judgment, I needed to understand exactly what they were looking for and how they were getting their information. I started with the most obvious source: my own house. I had always been proud of my home, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that Frank and I had bought in 1978 when the kids were still in school. Over the years, we'd updated the kitchen, added a screened porch, and turned the spare bedroom into a craft room, where I made quilts for church auctions and baby gifts for new mothers in the neighborhood. It was comfortable and familiar, filled with 45 years of memories and the accumulated possessions of a life well lived. But now I walked through my house with the critical eye of someone looking for evidence of decline. In the kitchen, I found a stack of mail that had been sitting on the counter for several days. Nothing urgent, just catalogs and charitable solicitations, but someone could interpret it as disorganization. In my bedroom, clothes were draped over a chair instead of hung in the closet, a habit that had never bothered me but might be seen as poor housekeeping. The bathroom had a collection of prescription bottles on the counter, some empty but not yet discarded, which could suggest confusion about medications. None of these things indicated any real problem with my ability to care for myself, but I could see how they might be interpreted by someone looking for evidence of decline. I spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning and organizing with a thoroughness I hadn't employed since the kids were small, and social workers might have made surprise visits. The next morning, I called Dr. Torres's office and scheduled the competency evaluation for the following week. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable just days before. I began systematically documenting my own activities and capabilities. I started a daily journal, recording my activities, the meals I cooked, the errands I ran, the books I read, and the conversations I had. If my family was building a case against my competency, I would build a stronger case for it. On Tuesday, Michelle stopped by unannounced, something she'd been doing more frequently since our conversation about cruise ships. She found me in the craft room, working on a quilt for my neighbor's new granddaughter. "Hi, Mom," she said, settling into the comfortable chair I kept in the corner for visitors. "What are you working on?" I showed her the intricate pattern I was piecing together. A complex design called wedding ring that required precise measurements and careful color coordination. "It's for little Emma Rodriguez." Her grandmother Rosa asked if I could make something special. Michelle examined the quilt blocks spread across my cutting table, and I saw something flicker across her face. Surprise, perhaps, that I was tackling such a complicated project. "Mom, this is beautiful, but aren't you finding the small pieces harder to work with?" "I know your eyes aren't what they used to be." "My eyes are fine, Michelle. I had them checked last month, and Dr. Peterson said they're excellent for someone my age." "Of course, but intricate needlework can be challenging even for people with perfect vision. Maybe you should consider switching to larger patterns, something that would be easier on your hands and eyes." There it was again, that gentle but persistent suggestion that I needed to limit myself, to choose easier options, to accept reduced capabilities that I didn't actually have. I realized that Michelle wasn't just visiting to chat. She was observing, assessing, looking for signs that I was struggling with tasks that had once been simple for me. "Michelle, I've been quilting for 40 years. I think I know my own limitations." "I know, Mom. I'm just saying that as we get older, it's important to be realistic about what we can handle. There's no shame in making adjustments." After she left, I sat in my craft room surrounded by the evidence of my continued capability and felt a profound sense of violation. My daughter had come into my home not to visit with me, but to evaluate me. Every comment about my eyes, my hands, my choice of projects was really an assessment of my declining abilities. That evening, I called Helen again, needing to talk to someone who understood what I was experiencing. "They're watching me," I told her. "Every conversation, every visit, they're looking for evidence that I can't take care of myself." "I hate to say I told you so," Helen replied, "but this is exactly how it started with Richard. His daughter began dropping by more often, always with some helpful suggestion about things he should change for his safety or convenience. Before he knew it, she had convinced him that his house was too big, his car was too dangerous, and his independence was too risky. What did he do? He fought back, but by the time he realized what was happening, she had already gathered enough evidence to convince a judge that he needed supervision. He's living in assisted living now, and she controls all his finances. But he's perfectly capable of living independently. You and I know that, but the court decided otherwise. The thing is, Evelyn, once your children start seeing you as incompetent, they interpret everything you do through that lens. If you're organized, you're obsessive. If you're relaxed about housekeeping, you're declining. If you want to try new things, you're being reckless. If you stick to familiar routines, you're afraid to adapt. You can't win." Wednesday brought another surprise visit, this time from David and Sandra. They arrived in the late afternoon, just as I was preparing dinner for myself, a simple meal of grilled chicken and steamed vegetables that I'd been making successfully for decades. "Mom, we thought we'd stop by and see how you're doing," David said, giving me the kind of hug that felt more like an inspection than an expression of affection. "I'm doing wonderfully. Would you like to stay for dinner? I can easily make more chicken." "Oh, we don't want to impose," Sandra said quickly. "We just wanted to check on you." "Check on me." Another phrase that was becoming painfully familiar. I invited them to sit in the living room while I finished cooking, but I noticed that they wandered around the house instead, stopping to examine various rooms with the careful attention of people conducting an inventory. "Mom," David called from the bathroom, "did you know that one of the tiles in your shower is loose?" I hadn't known actually, but it was hardly a crisis. "I'll have someone look at it this week." "You should be careful about things like that," Sandra added. Falls in the bathroom are one of the leading causes of injury for seniors. Sandra, I'm not a senior. I'm a 73-year-old woman who has been taking showers successfully for several decades. "Of course, Mom. We're just concerned about preventable accidents." During dinner, their questions continued with the same careful probing I was learning to recognize. How was I sleeping? Was I remembering to take my vitamins? Had I been getting confused about anything lately? Each question was presented as loving concern, but I could feel the assessment underneath. "You know," David said as we finished eating, "Sandra and I have been talking about your social life. Do you ever feel isolated living here by yourself?" "I have plenty of social interaction. I volunteer at the library, I'm active in my church, I have lunch with friends regularly." "But those are all structured activities," Sandra pointed out. "What about spontaneous social interaction? What about having people around for companionship and safety? Are you suggesting I need a babysitter?" "Not a babysitter, Mom, but maybe someone who could help with household tasks and provide some company. There are wonderful services now for people who want to maintain their independence while having a little extra support." There it was. The suggestion that I needed supervision, presented as a service for my convenience and companionship. I wondered how many other conversations like this were happening in families across the country. Adult children gradually convincing their parents that independence was dangerous and support was necessary. After David and Sandra left, I called Patricia's house, intending to speak with her directly about what I was observing. Robert answered the phone, his voice warm and friendly as always. Evelyn, how nice to hear from you. Patricia's at her book club tonight, but I'm happy to chat. How are you feeling? I'm feeling like my family is treating me like an invalid. There was a pause, then Robert's voice again, more cautious now. I'm sorry you feel that way. We're all just concerned about your well-being. Robert, I know you've been asking questions about my finances at the bank. Another pause, longer this time. Evelyn, as your financial advisor, it's my responsibility to understand your financial situation and help you make informed decisions. But you've been asking about procedures for elderly clients and cognitive decline. Why would you need that information unless you're planning to use it? I think there may be some misunderstanding here. I've been researching best practices for helping clients plan for their future needs. It's part of providing comprehensive financial advice. And the conversations about guardianship? Are those part of comprehensive financial advice too? The silence that followed was answer enough. Robert knew that I had overheard something, and he was calculating how to respond. Evelyn, I think we should sit down and have this conversation in person, with Patricia present. There are some things we need to discuss as a family. I'm sure there are. But Robert, before we have that conversation, I want you to know that I've consulted with an attorney. I know my rights, and I know what you're planning. We're not planning anything except to make sure you're protected and cared for. Protected from what? Cared for how? I'm a competent adult who doesn't need protection or care from anyone. Of course you are. But Evelyn, we love you, and we see some things that concern us. Your desire to travel alone, your resistance to practical safety modifications, your defensive attitude when we try to help. These aren't necessarily signs of incompetence, but they are signs that you might benefit from some support in making important decisions. I felt my temper flare in a way it hadn't in years. Robert, my desire to travel is not a sign of mental decline. My resistance to your interference is not defensive, it's appropriate. And my attitude toward your attempts to control my life is going to become a lot less cooperative if this continues. We're not trying to control your life, we're trying to preserve your quality of life. By taking away my right to make my own choices? By helping you make better choices. And who decides what constitutes better choices? You, Patricia? Some judge who's never met me? Robert's voice became more formal, more distant. Evelyn, I think this conversation is getting unproductive. Why don't we all sit down this weekend and discuss this calmly? There's nothing to discuss, Robert. I'm a competent adult, and I'll make my own decisions about my life, my money, and my vacations. After I hung up, I sat in my living room feeling like I was living in a different world than I had been just a week before. The phone calls, the visits, the questions, the suggestions were all part of a coordinated campaign to establish that I needed management and supervision. My family had convinced themselves that they were acting out of love, but what they were really doing was systematically undermining my autonomy. Thursday morning brought the most shocking revelation yet. I was in my garden, tending to the tomato plants that had always been my pride and joy, when I heard voices from Patricia's backyard next door. Our houses were separated by a low fence, and sound carried easily between our properties, especially on quiet mornings like this one. Patricia was talking to someone on her phone, and her voice carried the irritated tone she used when she was frustrated with a difficult client or situation. I know it's moving slowly, she was saying, but we have to be careful. Mom's sharper than we gave her credit for, and she's starting to catch on to what we're doing. I froze behind my tomato plants, my gardening gloves suddenly feeling like they weighed 100 pounds. The lawyer says we need more documentation before we can file anything. We need evidence of actual impairment, not just poor judgment. And buying a cruise ticket isn't enough to prove incompetence. There was a pause while the person on the other end spoke, then Patricia's voice again. I know, but we can't rush this. If we file too early and lose, we'll never get another chance. And honestly, the way Mom's been acting lately, suspicious and defensive, it's almost like she knows what we're planning. My hand went to my mouth to stifle a gasp. They were actually discussing filing legal papers to declare me incompetent, and they were frustrated that I was making it difficult for them. Michelle thinks we should focus on the safety angle. All those little things around the house, plus her insistence on living alone and traveling alone. David thinks the financial angle is stronger because of the cruise expense and her general resistance to practical advice about managing money. Another pause, then Patricia's voice became sharper with frustration. Robert's been trying to get more documentation from the bank, but Mom's gotten suspicious about that too. She actually confronted him about the guardianship research, which means she either overheard something or someone told her what to look for. I crept closer to the fence, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it from next door. The problem is that Mom's too functional for us to make a strong case right now. She drives, she cooks, she manages her finances, she volunteers, she's socially active. We need something bigger, some incident that demonstrates clear impairment. The person on the other end said something that made Patricia laugh, but it was a bitter sound without any humor. I know how that sounds, but we're not hoping she gets hurt. We're just waiting for her to make a mistake big enough that we can step in legally. The cruise thing could work if she actually books something expensive and impractical, especially if she refuses to listen to reasonable safety concerns. I had heard enough. I backed away from the fence on trembling legs and made it to my kitchen before my knees gave out entirely. My oldest daughter, the child I had raised with love and patience and sacrifice, was actively hoping for me to make a mistake big enough to justify taking control of my life. The phone rang while I was still sitting at my kitchen table trying to process what I had just heard. It was Michael, calling from Atlanta. "Hi, Mom. I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing with all the family drama about the cruise situation." "What family drama?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand that what I thought of as family drama was actually something much more serious. "Well, Patricia called me yesterday and said you've been acting defensive and suspicious lately. She's worried that you're not thinking clearly about your safety and finances." "Michael, do you think I'm not thinking clearly?" There was a pause, and I could hear traffic in the background, which meant he was probably walking to work or standing outside his office building. "Honestly, Mom, I think you're thinking more clearly than any of us. But I also think Patricia and Robert have some valid concerns about the practical aspects of solo travel at your age." "Such as?" "Such as the fact that cruise ships can be dangerous places for elderly people. The decks can be slippery, the medical facilities are limited, and if something happens to you in the middle of the ocean, we can't get to you." "Michael, millions of elderly people take cruises every year without incident." "I know, but they usually travel with companions or in groups. Solo travel is different, especially for someone your age." There it was again, someone your age. The phrase that had become the cornerstone of my family's argument for limiting my independence. "Michael, I need to ask you something directly. Are you and your siblings planning to petition for guardianship?" The silence that followed was so long I thought the call had been dropped. "Mom, where would you get an idea like that?" "Answer the question, Michael." "We're not planning anything except to make sure you're safe and happy." "That's not an answer." Another long pause, then Michael's voice, more serious than I had ever heard it. "Mom, if you continue to make decisions that put you at risk, and if you continue to refuse reasonable help and advice, then yes, we might have to consider legal options to protect you." "Legal options to protect me from what?" "To protect you from yourself." The conversation ended shortly after that, with both of us angry and hurt. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the familiar objects of my daily life, and realized that my children were united in their belief that I needed protection from my own choices. They had convinced themselves that taking away my autonomy was an act of love, and they were prepared to use the legal system to accomplish it. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Frank died. I made a reservation for a cruise. Not just any cruise, but a 30-day repositioning cruise from Fort Lauderdale to Barcelona, with stops in the Caribbean, the Azores, and Portugal. It was exactly the kind of expensive, adventurous, solo travel that my family would consider evidence of poor judgment. But I didn't make the reservation because I was acting impulsively or recklessly. I made it because I was 73 years old, in excellent health, financially secure, and tired of being treated like I was incompetent to make my own decisions. I made it because I wanted to prove to myself and to my family that I was still capable of living my life on my own terms. Most importantly, I made it because I was beginning to understand that this wasn't really about cruise ships or safety or age-appropriate activities. This was about power and control and the assumption that being elderly automatically meant being incapable. The confirmation email arrived in my inbox at 4:23 p.m., along with detailed information about the ship, the itinerary, and the pre-departure requirements. As I read through the materials, I felt a mixture of excitement and terror that I hadn't experienced in years. I was really doing this. I was going to spend a month at sea, traveling to places I had only dreamed about, proving to myself and everyone else that 73 was not too old for adventure. But first I had to survive my family's reaction when they discovered what I had done. And based on what I had learned about their plans for my future, that reaction was going to be much more serious than simple disappointment or concern. That evening, I called Helen to tell her about my decision. "You booked a cruise?" she said, and I could hear the mixture of admiration and concern in her voice. "Evelyn, that's wonderful, but are you prepared for the fallout?" "I think the fallout is coming whether I book a cruise or not. At least this way, I'll have something to show for it." "What are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to tell them the truth. That I'm a competent adult who has made a decision about my own life, and they can either support me or not. And if they try to use this as evidence that you need guardianship..." I looked around my kitchen, at the photos of my family and the mementos of a life well lived, and felt a determination I hadn't experienced since I was a young mother fighting for my children's futures. Then they're going to discover that their mother is a lot tougher than they realized. The phone rang at 7 in the morning on Friday, jolting me from the first peaceful sleep I'd had in weeks. Patricia's voice was sharp, with barely controlled panic. "Mom, we need to talk, right now. I'm coming over." "Patricia, what's wrong? Is someone hurt?" "Just stay where you are. Don't go anywhere. Don't make any calls. Don't do anything until I get there." She hung up before I could respond, leaving me standing in my kitchen in my bathrobe, holding the phone and wondering what crisis could have triggered such urgency. But deep in my gut, I already knew. Someone had discovered my cruise reservation. 20 minutes later, Patricia burst through my front door without knocking, followed by Robert, Michelle, Carlos, David, and Sandra. My entire family had assembled for what felt like an intervention, their faces grim with the kind of forced patience people use when dealing with someone they consider irrational. "Mom, sit down," Patricia said, her voice carrying the authoritative tone she used with her real estate clients. "We need to discuss what you did yesterday." "What I did yesterday was make a reservation for a vacation. Last time I checked, that wasn't a crime." "A 30-day cruise to Europe?" Robert's voice was incredulous. "Evelyn, do you have any idea how much money you just spent?" "I have a very clear idea, Robert. It's my money, and I can afford it." "That's not the point," Michelle interjected, her nurse's training evident in her calm but firm demeanor. "Mom, a month-long cruise at your age, traveling alone, with multiple international ports. The health risks alone are staggering." David stepped forward, his teacher's instincts making him try to reason with me. "Mom, we're not saying you can't travel. We're saying this particular trip is beyond what's safe or reasonable for someone in your situation." "My situation? What exactly is my situation, David?" The family exchanged glances, and I realized this was a conversation they had rehearsed. They had planned this confrontation, assigned roles, prepared arguments. I was facing a coordinated assault on my decision-making capacity. "Your situation," Sandra said carefully, "is that you're a 73-year-old widow living alone, with no immediate family support available if something goes wrong during extended international travel." "I see. And what would you consider appropriate travel for someone in my situation?" "A nice resort in Florida," Carlos suggested, "somewhere with medical facilities nearby, where we could reach you quickly if needed." "Or a cruise with other family members," Patricia added. "Maybe next year, when we can all plan something together." "Next year I'll be 74. Will I be too old then too?" "Mom, this isn't about age discrimination," Robert said, pulling out a folder I recognized as financial documents. "This is about practical reality. Let me show you what this trip actually costs." He spread papers across my dining room table, like evidence in a court case. The cruise cost, travel insurance, airfare to Fort Lauderdale, shore excursions, tips, and incidental expenses. The total was substantial, though well within my means. $12,000, Robert announced, for 1 month of vacation. That's more than some people make in an entire year. Robert, I've been saving for this kind of trip for 20 years. Frank and I always planned to travel when we retired, but he died before we had the chance. This money was specifically set aside for travel. But Mom, Michelle said, $12,000 could pay for a year of housekeeping services, or home health aides, or safety modifications to make your house more suitable for aging in place. I don't need housekeeping services, home health aides, or safety modifications. I need to live my life while I still can. While you still can? Patricia pounced on the phrase. What does that mean? Are you having health concerns you haven't told us about? The question was clearly a trap. If I said yes, they'd use it as evidence that I shouldn't travel. If I said no, they'd question why I felt urgency about living my life. I'm in excellent health, as you well know, but I'm also realistic about the fact that I won't be 73 forever. Exactly our point, David said, which is why you should be conserving your resources and avoiding unnecessary risks. Unnecessary risks like seeing the world, like fulfilling dreams I've had for decades. Unnecessary risks like traveling alone to foreign countries where you don't speak the language, eating unfamiliar foods that could make you sick, walking on potentially unstable surfaces in unfamiliar places, being hours away from adequate medical care if you have an emergency. The list came from Sandra, delivered with the precision of someone who had researched every possible danger. I realized they had spent considerable time preparing for this conversation, anticipating my arguments and developing counterpoints. I see you've all given this a lot of thought, I said. Tell me, when did you have time to research all these concerns? When did you plan this family meeting? How long have you been coordinating your response to my travel plans? Mom, we're not coordinating anything, Michelle said, but her voice lacked conviction. We're just concerned family members who want what's best for you. Really? Because from where I'm sitting, this feels like a carefully orchestrated campaign to undermine my confidence in my own judgment. Robert cleared his throat and pulled out another set of documents. Evelyn, I've taken the liberty of consulting with a travel insurance specialist and a medical travel expert. Both have expressed serious concerns about solo travel for someone in your demographic. My demographic: elderly travelers with no immediate family support available in case of emergency. I'm not elderly, Robert. I'm 73 years old, in excellent health with full mental capacity. Of course you are, Patricia said in the tone people use with small children. But statistically, people your age who travel alone are at significantly higher risk for accidents, medical emergencies, and becoming victims of crime. People my age? Patricia, I raised you to be better than this. I taught you not to make assumptions about people based on their age, race, or any other characteristic they can't control. This isn't about assumptions, Mom. This is about documented facts. Carlos leaned forward, his expression earnest. Mrs. Harrison, I work with elderly patients every day in my physical therapy practice. I see what happens when people overestimate their capabilities and put themselves in situations they can't handle. And what situations can't I handle, Carlos? Walking on wet decks in rough seas. Navigating crowded airports with heavy luggage. Managing medications in different time zones. Communicating with foreign medical personnel if you need help. Each concern was reasonable when viewed in isolation, but together they painted a picture of someone who was frail, confused, and incapable of basic problem solving. The portrait they were creating bore no resemblance to the woman who had successfully managed a household, raised 4 children, helped run a business, and lived independently for 5 years since her husband's death. I think, I said carefully, that you're all forgetting something important. I'm not asking for your permission to take this trip. I'm not asking for your financial support or your physical assistance. I'm simply informing you of a decision I've made about my own life. But that's exactly the problem, Robert said. You're making major decisions without consulting the people who love you and care about your welfare. Robert, I'm an adult. I don't need to consult anyone about my personal choices. Actually, Patricia said, and her voice took on a formal quality that made my blood run cold. We think you do. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. Mom, we've been talking to a lawyer about your situation, and we think it might be time to consider some legal arrangements that would give us the ability to help you make important decisions. What kind of legal arrangements? Guardianship, David said quietly, or at least conservatorship over your finances. The word hit me like a physical blow. We had arrived at the moment I had been dreading. The ultimate revelation of their intentions. My children wanted to legally remove my right to make my own decisions. You want to have me declared incompetent. We want to make sure you're protected, Michelle said. Mom, this cruise reservation is exactly the kind of impulsive, potentially dangerous decision that shows you might need help with major choices. Impulsive? I've been dreaming about traveling to Europe since I was 20 years old. But you made this reservation without discussing it with anyone, without considering the risks, without thinking about the impact on your family if something goes wrong. The impact on my family? Mom, if you get hurt or sick during this trip, who do you think is going to have to deal with the consequences? Patricia's voice was rising with frustration. Who's going to have to fly to Europe to bring you home? Who's going to have to handle the medical bills and insurance claims? Who's going to have to live with the guilt if something happens to you because we didn't stop you from making a dangerous decision? There it was. The real issue wasn't my safety or my money or my age. The real issue was their fear of responsibility, their terror that my independence might create obligations or complications for them. So this is about making your lives easier, I said. No, Mom, it's about making your life safer, David protested, but his voice lacked conviction. Really? Because it sounds like you want to control my choices so you don't have to worry about the consequences of my freedom. That's not fair, Sandra said. We love you, and we want you to be happy. But we also want you to be realistic about your limitations. What limitations? I drive, I cook, I manage my finances, I volunteer, I maintain my home, I have an active social life. What exactly am I limited in doing? Solo international travel, Robert said firmly. That's beyond what's reasonable for someone in your circumstances. My circumstances being that I'm old, your circumstances being that you're alone, with no immediate support system, taking unnecessary risks with your health and safety. I looked around the table at my children and their spouses, these people I had loved and sacrificed for and trusted completely. They were looking at me with the kind of patient exasperation usually reserved for stubborn children or confused elderly relatives. They had convinced themselves that taking away my autonomy was an act of love. Let me make sure I understand, I said. You want to petition a court to declare me incompetent because I want to take a cruise? We want to petition for limited guardianship to help you make major decisions that could affect your health, safety, and financial security. Patricia corrected. And who would be my guardian? We would share the responsibility, Robert said. Patricia and I would handle the financial aspects, Michelle would oversee medical decisions, and David would coordinate day-to-day care. Care? I don't need care. I need you to respect my right to live my own life. Mom, we do respect you, Michelle said. But respect doesn't mean standing by while someone you love makes dangerous choices. And who decides what constitutes a dangerous choice? You? A judge who's never met me? People with experience in elder care and family law, Carlos said. People who understand the risks and complications that can arise when elderly individuals don't have proper support systems. I have a proper support system. I have friends, neighbors, my church community, medical providers who know me well. But none of them are family, Patricia pointed out. None of them are legally responsible for your welfare. And none of them are trying to take away my right to make my own decisions. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock Frank had bought for our 25th wedding anniversary. I looked at each face around the table, searching for any sign that someone understood what they were proposing to do to me. I want all of you to leave, I said finally. Mom, we're not done discussing this, Patricia protested. Yes, we are. You've made your position clear and I've made mine clear. There's nothing more to discuss. What about the cruise reservation? Robert asked. Are you going to cancel it? Absolutely not. Then we're going to have to take steps to protect you from yourself. Robert, if you file any legal papers against me, you'll discover that I'm not as defenseless as you think I am. Mom, we're not trying to hurt you, David said. We're trying to help you. Then respect my choices, support my independence, stop treating me like a child. We'll respect your choices when they're reasonable, Patricia said. This cruise is not reasonable. After they left, I sat in my dining room surrounded by the scattered financial documents they had used as evidence against me. The papers told the story of a woman who had managed her money responsibly for decades, saved diligently for her goals, and made thoughtful decisions about her future. But my family had presented this same information as evidence that I needed supervision and control. I called attorney Margaret Fisher and left a message explaining what had just happened. Then I called Dr. Torres's office and moved up my competency evaluation to the following Monday. If my family was going to try to have me declared incompetent, I needed professional documentation of my mental acuity as quickly as possible. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done since Frank died. I packed a suitcase and drove to Helen's house in Phoenix. I needed to be somewhere safe while I figured out my next steps. And I couldn't stay in Clearwater, where my every move would be monitored and interpreted as evidence of declining capacity. The drive to Phoenix took me through parts of the country I hadn't seen in years. As I drove through small towns and desert landscapes, I felt a sense of freedom that had been missing from my life since this whole ordeal began. I was making my own decisions, going where I wanted to go, proving to myself that I was still capable of independence. Helen welcomed me with the fierce protectiveness of someone who understood exactly what I was facing. Her retirement community was filled with people who had similar stories, elderly individuals whose adult children had convinced themselves that love meant control. You did the right thing by leaving, Helen said as we sat on her patio overlooking the desert. Once they start the legal process, everything you do gets scrutinized. Every choice becomes evidence. Every mistake becomes proof of incompetence. But I haven't made any mistakes. I haven't shown any signs of declining capacity. It doesn't matter. The system is set up to err on the side of caution, which means erring on the side of control. Judges would rather take away someone's rights unnecessarily than risk being blamed if something goes wrong. That evening, I called each of my children to let them know where I was. Patricia was furious that I had left without telling anyone, interpreting my departure as more evidence of poor judgment. Michelle was worried about my driving such a long distance alone. David was confused about why I felt the need to leave at all. Michael was the only one who seemed to understand that I might need space to think. Mom, I know this is hard, Michael said, but maybe we could find some middle ground. Maybe a shorter cruise, or travel with a group, or something that addresses everyone's concerns. Michael, the issue isn't the cruise. The issue is that your siblings want to take away my right to make my own decisions. They're scared, Mom. They love you, and they're terrified something will happen to you. So they want to make sure nothing ever happens to me again? They want to keep me safe by keeping me trapped? It's not about trapping you. It's about making sure you have support when you need it. I'll ask for support when I need it. Right now, I need the freedom to live my own life. Sunday morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Robert's voice was formal and cold when he told me that they had filed emergency petition for temporary guardianship, citing my sudden departure from Clearwater as evidence that I was a danger to myself. You what? I could barely process what I was hearing. Evelyn, you left the state without telling anyone where you were going. You're traveling alone at your age, making impulsive decisions about expensive trips, and now you've abandoned your home and responsibilities. The court agrees that intervention is necessary. Robert, I'm visiting my sister. That's not abandoning anything. You packed a suitcase and drove 800 miles without telling anyone your plans. At your age, that constitutes a safety risk. At my age, that constitutes exercising my right to travel freely. The hearing is scheduled for this Friday. If you don't return to Clearwater by Thursday, the court will issue a warrant for protective custody. I hung up the phone feeling like my world had collapsed completely. In the space of 1 week, I had gone from being an independent woman planning a dream vacation to being a fugitive from my own family's legal assault on my freedom. Helen found me crying on her patio and held me while I sobbed out my fear and rage and disbelief. "They can't do this," I kept saying. "I haven't done anything wrong." "They can, and they are," Helen said grimly. "But honey, you're not going to face this alone. I know lawyers here who specialize in fighting these cases. You're going to go back to Florida and show that judge exactly how competent you are. What if I lose? What if they convince the court that I need a guardian? Then we'll appeal, and if we lose the appeal, we'll find another way. But Evelyn, you can't give up. If you let them win this, you'll spend the rest of your life regretting it." That night, I made a decision that would determine the rest of my life. I wasn't going to run away from this fight. I wasn't going to let my children's fears dictate my future. I was going to return to Clearwater, face their legal challenge, and prove to everyone, including myself, that being 73 didn't mean being incompetent. But first, I was going to take that cruise. If the court wanted to see dangerous, impulsive behavior from an elderly woman, I was going to give them exactly what they expected. I was going to book the most elaborate, expensive, adventurous trip I could imagine, and I was going to do it while my family was preparing their case against my competency. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had accused me of poor judgment for wanting to travel, so I was going to travel in the most spectacular way possible. They had claimed I was financially irresponsible, so I was going to spend my money exactly as I chose. They had said I was a danger to myself, so I was going to prove that the only danger I faced was from their attempts to control me. Monday morning, I called a luxury travel agent in Phoenix and upgraded my cruise reservation to the owner's suite with a private balcony and butler service. I added every shore excursion available, booked business-class flights, and arranged for a professional photographer to document my entire journey. If my family wanted evidence of my spending habits, I was going to give them evidence that would make their heads spin. Then I called Margaret Fisher and told her I would be back in Clearwater on Wednesday, ready to fight for my life. I walked into the Pinellas County Courthouse on Friday morning, feeling like I was going to war, which in many ways I was. My armor consisted of a navy blue suit that Frank had always said made me look formidable, a briefcase full of documentation proving my competency, and a determination forged by 73 years of refusing to let anyone else dictate my choices. Margaret Fisher met me at the courthouse steps, her expression grim but confident. "Evelyn, I want you to remember something during this hearing. You are not on trial for being elderly. You are not required to justify your desire to live independently. The burden of proof is on them to demonstrate that you lack capacity, not on you to prove that you have it." Behind Margaret, I saw a woman I didn't recognize, elderly but sharp-eyed, carrying herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. "This is Dr. Rebecca Torres," Margaret said. "She conducted your competency evaluation yesterday, and she'll be testifying on your behalf." Dr. Torres shook my hand with a firm grip. "Mrs. Harrison, I've been doing cognitive assessments for 25 years, and I want you to know that your test results were exemplary. Your memory, reasoning ability, and judgment all score well above average for your age group. In fact, they score above average for any age group." As we entered the courthouse, I saw my family clustered near the courtroom doors. Patricia wore the same expression she'd had when the children were young, and she was determined to prove she was right about something. Robert stood beside her with a folder thick enough to choke a horse, no doubt filled with evidence of my supposed incompetence. Michelle looked uncomfortable, as if she was beginning to question what they were doing. David kept glancing at me with something that might have been regret. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, more like a conference room than the dramatic judicial chambers I'd seen in movies. Judge Linda Vasquez was a woman about 50, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She reviewed the papers before her with the methodical attention of someone who understood that lives hung in the balance of her decisions. "This is a petition for emergency guardianship," Judge Vasquez began, "filed by Patricia Chen and Robert Chen on behalf of Evelyn Harrison. The petitioners claim that Mrs. Harrison lacks the capacity to make decisions regarding her health, safety, and finances, and that she poses a danger to herself without proper supervision. Robert stood to present their case, his voice carrying the professional confidence that had made him successful in financial services. Your Honor, we've known Evelyn Harrison for decades, and we've watched with growing concern as she's begun making increasingly poor decisions that put her health and safety at risk. He opened his folder and began laying out their evidence, like a prosecutor building a case for conviction. Mrs. Harrison recently booked a 30-day cruise to Europe, traveling alone at age 73, at a cost of over $12,000. When her family expressed concern about the safety and financial implications of this decision, she became defensive and hostile. Judge Vasquez looked up from the papers. Mr. Chen, is it your contention that wanting to take a cruise constitutes evidence of mental incompetence? Not the desire to cruise, Your Honor, but the specific circumstances. Solo travel for someone her age, in foreign countries where she doesn't speak the language, for an extended period without family support, at significant financial cost. It demonstrates poor judgment about her own limitations. I see. What other evidence do you have of poor judgment? Patricia stood to join her husband. Your Honor, my mother has been living alone since my father died 5 years ago, and we've noticed increasing signs that she's struggling to maintain her independence safely. Her housekeeping has become inconsistent, she's been forgetting conversations we've had, and she's become increasingly resistant to practical suggestions about home safety modifications. What kind of safety modifications? Grab bars in the bathroom, better lighting, removal of throw rugs that could cause falls. Common sense improvements that any elderly person should welcome, but she refuses to consider them. Judge Vasquez made notes on her legal pad. And the financial concerns? Robert pulled out bank statements and financial records. Mrs. Harrison has been making increasingly impulsive purchases and has shown resistance to professional financial advice. The cruise reservation was made without consultation with her financial advisor, which is concerning given her age and the substantial cost involved. Mr. Chen, are you Mrs. Harrison's official financial advisor? Yes, Your Honor. I've been managing her portfolio since her husband died. And has she missed any payments, bounced any checks, or made any transactions that would indicate financial incompetence? Robert hesitated. No, Your Honor, but the cruise reservation demonstrates a pattern of impulsive spending without consideration of long-term financial planning. I see. What other evidence supports your petition? Michelle stepped forward, and I felt a stab of betrayal deeper than anything I'd experienced yet. Your Honor, I'm a registered nurse, and I've observed changes in my mother that concern me from a medical standpoint. She's become more defensive about her health decisions, more resistant to family input about her care, and more insistent on maintaining independence despite clear safety risks. What safety risks specifically? Living alone at her age, driving without regular vision tests, managing multiple medications without supervision, and now planning extended solo travel. Each of these individually might be manageable, but together they create a pattern of poor safety awareness. Judge Vasquez turned to Margaret Fisher. Counselor, I'd like to hear from Mrs. Harrison and her representatives. Margaret stood with the confidence of someone who had been fighting these battles for years. Your Honor, Mrs. Harrison is a 73-year-old woman in excellent health who has been managing her own affairs successfully for 5 years since her husband's death. She drives, maintains her home, volunteers in her community, manages complex financial affairs, and has an active social life. The evidence presented by the petitioners fails to demonstrate any actual incapacity. Dr. Torres was called to testify first. Your Honor, I conducted a comprehensive cognitive assessment of Mrs. Harrison yesterday. She scored in the superior range on tests of memory, reasoning, and judgment. Her recall for recent and remote events was perfect. Her abstract thinking was sophisticated, and her problem-solving abilities were excellent. I found no evidence whatsoever of cognitive impairment. Doctor, what about the cruise reservation? Could that indicate poor judgment? Your Honor, many people Mrs. Harrison's age travel extensively and safely. The desire to see the world, even at 73, is not indicative of mental impairment. In fact, people who remain curious and adventurous often maintain better cognitive function as they age. Judge Vasquez nodded and made more notes. Mrs. Harrison, I'd like to hear from you directly. Why do you want to take this cruise? I stood, feeling the weight of my entire future resting on my ability to articulate what should have been obvious to anyone with common sense. Your Honor, I've been dreaming of traveling to Europe since I was a young woman. My husband and I planned to take this kind of trip when we retired, but he died before we had the chance. I'm 73 years old, in excellent health, and financially capable of fulfilling this dream. I don't understand why that should require anyone's permission. Mrs. Harrison, your family is concerned about the safety implications of solo travel at your age. How do you respond to those concerns? Your Honor, I appreciate that my family loves me and wants me to be safe. But safety cannot be the only consideration in how I live my life. Millions of elderly people travel safely every year. Cruise ships have excellent medical facilities and safety protocols. I've researched every aspect of this trip thoroughly, and I'm confident in my ability to handle any situations that might arise. What about the financial concerns? $12,000 is a substantial sum. It is, Your Honor, but it's money I've been saving specifically for travel. My finances are in excellent order, my bills are current, and this expense will not create any hardship. I fail to see how spending my own money on something I've wanted for decades constitutes evidence of incompetence. Judge Vasquez asked several more questions about my daily activities, my medical care, my social connections, and my decision-making process regarding the cruise. With each answer, I felt more confident that the truth was becoming clear. I was not an incompetent elderly woman who needed protection from herself. I was an independent adult whose family had confused love with control. Margaret called character witnesses who testified about my volunteer work at the library, my participation in church activities, and my role as a mentor to younger widows in the community. Each person who spoke painted a picture of someone who was engaged, capable, and contributing meaningfully to her community. The hearing lasted 3 hours. When Judge Vasquez finally called for a recess to consider her decision, I felt like I had been holding my breath for days. Margaret and Dr. Torres flanked me as we waited in the hallway, offering quiet reassurance while my family huddled together across the corridor, their faces reflecting various degrees of anxiety and determination. When court reconvened, Judge Vasquez's expression was unreadable. I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I've given careful consideration to the testimony from both sides. This is always a difficult decision because it involves balancing an individual's right to autonomy against legitimate concerns for their welfare. My heart hammered against my ribs as she continued. However, the evidence presented by the petitioners fails to meet the legal standard for demonstrating incapacity. Mrs. Harrison has shown no signs of cognitive impairment, no inability to manage her financial affairs, and no behavior that would constitute a danger to herself or others. The desire to travel, even extensively and alone, is not evidence of poor judgment or mental incapacity. Relief flooded through me so intensely that I had to grip Margaret's arm to keep from collapsing. Furthermore, Judge Vasquez continued, I'm concerned about the apparent attempt to use the legal system to override Mrs. Harrison's personal choices, simply because her family disagrees with those choices. Guardianship is a serious legal remedy reserved for people who truly cannot care for themselves, not for family members who want to impose their preferences on a competent adult. She looked directly at my family. I understand that you love Mrs. Harrison and want her to be safe, but love does not give you the right to control another adult's decisions. Mrs. Harrison has demonstrated that she is fully capable of making her own choices, even if those choices involve some risk. The petition was denied. I was free to live my life as I chose, to take my cruise, to maintain my independence. But as I looked across the courtroom at my children's faces, I realized that winning this legal battle might have cost me something equally important: my relationship with the people I loved most in the world. After the hearing, I stood on the courthouse steps feeling like I had just survived a war. Margaret and Dr. Torres congratulated me on the victory, but the celebration felt hollow. My family filed past me without speaking, their faces reflecting various combinations of anger, disappointment, and embarrassment. Only Michael stopped to talk to me. Mom, I'm sorry it came to this. I never thought they'd actually go through with filing papers. But you didn't try to stop them either, did you? I thought maybe the judge would order some kind of compromise, some middle ground that would satisfy everyone. Michael, There is no middle ground between freedom and control. Either I have the right to make my own decisions, or I don't. I know that now. And Mom, for what it's worth, I'm proud of you for fighting this. That evening, I sat in my hotel room in Clearwater, staring at the legal documents that had officially confirmed my right to live my own life. I should have felt triumphant, vindicated, proud of my victory over forces that would have controlled me. Instead, I felt profoundly lonely. The next morning, I did something that surprised even me. I called a real estate agent and inquired about selling my house. If my family wanted to treat me like a burden, a problem to be managed, then perhaps it was time to remove myself from their daily concerns entirely. I couldn't live in the same town where my children were constantly monitoring my activities and waiting for me to prove their predictions about my incompetence. I also called the cruise line and confirmed my upgrade to the owner's suite. I was going to take that trip in the most luxurious way possible, not as a gesture of spite, but as a celebration of my hard-won freedom. I was going to prove to myself and to anyone who cared to notice that 73 could be the beginning of the most adventurous phase of my life, not the end of it. But first, I had one more phone call to make. I dialed Helen's number in Phoenix, needing to share my victory with someone who would understand its true significance. I won, I told her simply. I never doubted you would, Helen replied. The question now is what you're going to do with your freedom. I'm going to use it, I said. Every single day, for as long as I have left. 2 weeks later, I was standing on the deck of the Celebrity Silhouette, watching the Florida coastline disappear behind me as we headed toward the open Atlantic. The owner's suite was everything the travel agent had promised. A private balcony, a butler named James who anticipated my every need, and space enough to spread out all the books I planned to read during my month at sea. But the real luxury wasn't the champagne or the Egyptian cotton sheets or the nightly turn-down service. The real luxury was the knowledge that I was exactly where I had chosen to be, doing exactly what I had decided to do, living my life on my own terms, despite everyone who had tried to convince me I was too old, too fragile, too incapable. As the ship sailed into the sunset, I thought about my family back in Florida, probably wondering if I was safe, if I was managing okay on my own, if their worst fears about elderly solo travel were about to be confirmed. Part of me felt sad that they couldn't share this moment of pure freedom with me. But a larger part of me felt grateful that I had fought for the right to experience it at all. The next morning, I woke up in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, 73 years old, and completely free to be whoever I wanted to be. It was the best feeling I'd had in years. 6 months after returning from my European odyssey, I stood in the captain's quarters of my own cruise ship, watching the sun set over the Caribbean as we sailed toward our next port of call. The irony wasn't lost on me that the woman my family had tried to declare incompetent for wanting to take a cruise had ended up purchasing an entire cruise line. The transformation had begun during my month at sea. Somewhere between the ancient ruins of Portugal and the sun-drenched islands of the Azores, I had an epiphany that changed everything. I wasn't just a passenger on this ship. I was a customer paying premium prices for an experience that, while lovely, could be dramatically improved. The staff was overworked, the excursions were generic, and the dining options catered to the lowest common denominator rather than celebrating the diverse tastes of international travelers. More importantly, I realized that solo travelers, particularly older women like myself, were treated as anomalies rather than valued customers. We were seated at small tables in corners, offered basic cabins with interior views, and excluded from activities that assumed couples or families. The cruise industry was missing an enormous opportunity to serve a growing demographic of independent, affluent, adventure-seeking seniors. By the time we docked in Barcelona, I had filled 3 notebooks with observations and ideas. Instead of flying home immediately, I spent 2 weeks traveling through Spain and France, visiting other cruise ports, and interviewing passengers about their experiences. What I discovered was an industry ripe for disruption by someone who understood what modern seniors actually wanted from their travel experiences. The phone call to my financial advisor was memorable for all the right reasons. Instead of Robert, I worked with Jennifer Matthews, a brilliant woman in her 40s who specialized in investment acquisitions for high-net-worth clients. When I explained that I wanted to purchase a small cruise line, she didn't question my age or competency. She asked about my business plan, Mrs. Harrison, the cruise industry is dominated by massive corporations with enormous ships carrying thousands of passengers. What's your vision for a different approach? Smaller ships, more personalized service, and a focus on solo travelers and mature adventurers, I explained. Ships that carry 300 passengers instead of 3,000, with suite-style accommodations, expert-led excursions, and activities designed for people who want intellectual and cultural enrichment, along with relaxation. Have you identified a target acquisition? Mediterranean Voyages. They operate 4 ships, primarily in the Caribbean and Mediterranean markets. They're family-owned, financially stable, but struggling to compete with the major lines. I think they'd be interested in selling to someone who shares their vision for quality over quantity. The acquisition took 4 months to complete. During that time, I worked with maritime consultants, hospitality experts, and marketing professionals to develop a comprehensive business plan for what would become Harrison Heritage Cruises. The name honored Frank's memory while establishing a brand focused on celebrating life's adventures at every age. The most satisfying moment came when I called my children to tell them about my new business venture. Patricia's silence when I explained that I had purchased a cruise line was worth every dollar of the legal fees I had paid to defend my competency. "Mom, you bought a what?" Michelle's voice carried the same disbelief they'd expressed when I'd first mentioned wanting to take a cruise. "I bought a cruise line, sweetheart. 4 ships, 300 employees, and ports of call throughout the Caribbean and Mediterranean." "But Mom," David said carefully, "do you have any experience running a cruise line?" "I have 40 years of experience in customer service from running Frank's hardware store, a lifetime of managing complex logistics as a mother and homemaker, and recent first-hand experience as a cruise passenger who saw tremendous room for improvement. Plus, I'm surrounding myself with experts who know the industry inside and out." "This is insane," Robert's voice came through the speakerphone from Patricia's office. "Evelyn, you can't just decide to become a cruise line owner because you enjoyed your vacation." "Actually, Robert, I can. That's the beauty of being a competent adult, with financial resources and entrepreneurial vision. I can make whatever decisions I choose about my life and my money." Michael was the first to offer genuine support. "Mom, this sounds incredible. What's your timeline for the first Harrison Heritage Cruise?" "We launch in 6 weeks, with a repositioning cruise from Miami to the Mediterranean. All-suite accommodations, butler service for every guest, expert lecturers on history and culture, and shore excursions led by local experts rather than generic tour guides. And it's specifically designed for solo travelers? Solo travelers, couples, small groups, anyone who wants a more intimate and sophisticated cruise experience. But yes, we're particularly focused on serving the solo travel market that the major cruise lines largely ignore." The launch of Harrison Heritage Cruises exceeded every expectation. Our first cruise sold out within 3 days of opening reservations, with a waiting list that stretched for months. Passengers ranged in age from 50 to 90, with the majority being independent, well-traveled individuals who had grown tired of the megaship experience. What made the venture truly successful wasn't just the business model, but the community it created. Solo travelers who had felt isolated on other cruises found themselves part of a vibrant social network. Dinner conversations brought together retired professors, former diplomats, successful entrepreneurs, and adventurous grandmothers who had finally claimed their right to see the world on their own terms. The media attention was unexpected but gratifying. Travel magazines wrote features about the grandmother who had revolutionized solo cruising. Business publications analyzed our disruptive approach to the cruise industry. Most satisfying were the letters from passengers who thanked me for creating travel experiences that honored their intelligence, independence, and desire for authentic cultural exchange. 1 year after the guardianship hearing, I hosted a special reunion cruise for passengers who had sailed with us multiple times. As I stood on the bridge of our flagship vessel, the Heritage Explorer, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. My family's attempt to control my choices had ultimately led me to create something far more adventurous and meaningful than I had ever imagined possible. The reconciliation with my children came gradually. Michelle was the first to visit one of our ships, bringing her teenagers to experience what their grandmother had built. She spent 3 days exploring the Caribbean with us, and I watched her discover the same sense of freedom and possibility that had transformed my own life. "Mom, I owe you an apology," she said as we stood on the ship's deck watching dolphins play in our wake. We were so focused on protecting you that we never considered what we might be protecting you from. This is amazing. David and Sandra joined us for a Mediterranean cruise 6 months later, and I had the pleasure of watching my son rediscover his sense of wonder as we explored ancient Greek islands and medieval Italian villages. He spent hours in deep conversation with our onboard historians, reminded of why he had become a teacher in the first place. Patricia and Robert were the last to acknowledge what I had accomplished, and their visit was motivated more by curiosity about my business success than any desire to repair our relationship. But somewhere between Barcelona and Rome, Patricia began to see me not as her aging mother who needed protection, but as a successful entrepreneur who had identified a market opportunity and executed a brilliant business strategy. "I don't understand how you knew this would work," she admitted as we dined on the ship's terrace restaurant, watching the lights of Monaco sparkle across the water. "I knew it would work because I understood the customer," I replied. "I knew what people like me wanted from travel, because I was willing to listen to what people like me were actually saying, instead of making assumptions based on their age." Even Michael, who had supported me throughout the ordeal, was amazed by what Harrison Heritage Cruises had become. "Mom, you've basically created a floating university for adventurous adults. This isn't just a business, it's a movement." Today, 3 years after that first cruise reservation that nearly cost me my independence, Harrison Heritage Cruises operates 8 ships and employs over 1,000 people. We've been recognized by travel industry organizations for innovation in senior travel, and our passenger satisfaction ratings are the highest in the cruise industry. But the real measure of success isn't the financial returns or industry recognition. It's the letters I receive from passengers who tell me that sailing with us gave them the courage to pursue other dreams they had abandoned. It's the friendships formed between solo travelers who discovered they weren't as alone as they thought. It's the families who have learned to see their elderly relatives not as burdens to be managed, but as individuals with continuing capacity for growth and adventure. My family now works with me in various capacities. Michelle serves as our Chief Medical Officer, ensuring that we maintain the highest standards of health and safety for our passengers. David leads our cultural enrichment programs, bringing his passion for history and education to every voyage. Even Patricia has found a role, managing our real estate acquisitions as we expand our port facilities. Most evenings, I stand on the deck of whichever ship I'm sailing on and watch the endless expanse of ocean stretching to the horizon. At 76, I'm healthier, happier, and more challenged than I've been in decades. I'm proof that age is not a limitation but an opportunity, that wisdom combined with courage can create possibilities that younger people might never imagine. The woman my children tried to declare incompetent for wanting to take a cruise ship vacation had done something far more dramatic. She had bought the cruise line and transformed an entire industry's approach to serving mature travelers. Sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate you is simply proving them spectacularly wrong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.